Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Cup, Duet Reviews, brought to you by Cup of Hemlock Theatre. I will be your host for this episode, Ryan Borochovitz, and today we are talking about the show A Public Display of Affection, which is currently playing at the Streetcar Crow's Nest until April 20th. It is a co-production produced by Studio 180 Theatre in association with Crow's Theatre, written by and starring Jonathan Wilson, and directed by Mark McGrinder. And today I am joined by a very special new guest who's never been on the Cup before. He is a composer and a very accomplished pianist, and he makes his own jewelry. Robert Sekulovich, thank you for being here. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you, Ryan.
Yes, we're so happy to have you. You are a new guest on the show, so why don't we start by just letting you introduce yourself a little bit, tell our audience who is Robert.
What's to say? I'm a Toronto native, born and raised next door to where we're broadcasting from today, and moved to New York when I was 22 for a couple of decades and came back to Toronto 26 years ago. Very happy to be back, especially right now. Mm-hmm. I do make my own jewelry. Actually, I have a jewelry company and I've been selling jewelry now for about 35 years, but I'm happy to say I'm retiring.
Oh, congrats.
Yeah, not yet because it's hard to pull out, but I do want to just enjoy.
Every time you think you're out, they pull you back in.
I get orders and then I have to fill them. So I'm going to take down my website. I'm on Etsy. If anybody wants to buy my jewelry, there's a free plug.
If you're broadcasting it out to the audience who's clamoring for it, it's going to be very hard for you to retire.
This is true. Actually, there's very little clamoring. And I write music for the piano, which is my real passion and my art, much more than the jewelry, which was more of a craft. All around artists get involved in anything I can try and enjoy. And I'm happy to do it all.
Yes, and I'm sure it's all very happy to have you doing it. I have to get into our usual icebreaker question. What is in your cup today?
It's a glass.
And
it's Armagnac, so fancy schmancy cognac, which is brandy by another name. Picked up in France last October from a little guy with a little chateau and a little business. He does a few bottles a year. And for special occasions, I sip it, which I'm happy to do right now.
Yes, I'm so honored that you consider this a special occasion. In my cup today, I have orange pekoe tea, which is in our The Cup Cup. Hey, that's the show you're watching and or listening to right now. All right. A Public Display of Affection, PDA. We're going to, as always, begin with a brief non-spoiler section where we'll just talk in sort of less specific terms about what the show is, what we thought of it, and then we will break off into a clear spoiler section. So, Robert, do you mind if I toss this to you? How would you describe the show, A Public Display of Affection, to those who might be interested in seeing it?
Broadly speaking, it's a one-man show, a reminiscence. It's by turns humorous and poignant. The actor is also the writer, and Jonathan Wilson, a gay man who's obviously feeling his age a little bit. He would be, I guess, pushing 60 now, or maybe 61, I'm not sure, which is a little bit laughable. He considers himself a queer senior. Or
queer elder is the term that is used in the show.
Elder.
Yeah.
And no spoiler here, I turned 70 last October, so he's a kid. As for you, you're an embryo. So I take a little bit of issue with being called an elder. 70 is the new 25, and I feel every minute of my 25 years. As for the show, he's funny when he's funny, and he reminded me actually a little bit of David Sedaris.
Yeah, yes, I do.
A sort of a diminutive, bubbly character, and then it turns dark. And there, he does have some reminiscences. I guess, I don't know how far spoiler is, but you can't talk about your life story as a gay man in the last few decades without it getting dark. There's definitely a dark side to history. And he doesn't avoid it.
Yeah, I think that's a very good capstone way of describing the show without getting too deep into the things that people might already be imagining it gets into, but we'll
I
save
bet
that
they get
for,
it right too.
yeah, but we'll save the more specifics for the latter portion. I think it's funny, I guess, too, a little bit of why you're here, why I thought you would be the perfect interlocutor for the show like this, and I hope this doesn't ruffle your feathers in relation to the comments about the age and who counts as an elder. But when I did read the description for this show upon receiving the invite to review it, I got the sense that it reminded me a lot of stories you have told me when you and I first met. You have a very endearing habit of getting into memory lane, and I think it's incredibly charming. And you could certainly do a solo show of your own if you wanted to unpack those experiences for a paying audience.
It did cross my mind. The paying audience part doesn't interest me. Captive audience, mind you, you're quite right. I do have that endearing to some habit of breaking into anecdotalia. Let's just give credit where it's due. There is a craft to
Yes.
a memoir, a one-man show, and he definitely gave a wonderfully rounded, narrative driven, but also it had sort of theme driven. And he did a nice, deft back and forth between silly and funny and nothing funny at all about it. I will admit to have gotten verklempt a few times.
Yeah.
His experiences paralleled mine. Even though I'm almost a decade older than him, we went through a lot of the same sorts of things. Everyone did from my generation. It's not a funny story. So yeah, you need humor to get through a story like that. And he was good and funny. We got some good laughs.
Yeah. Would you consider the humor something like a spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down, or is it more of like a false sense of security before it makes a heel turn? I'm trying to articulate what I think about the relationship between the humor and the somberness of it all.
I think if he had never ventured into humor and simply told the darker side of the story, it would have been hard to endure.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't a picnic a lot of the time, for me especially. And I think I noticed that the audience was generally between around 25 and 35 to my eye. So these are people who didn't experience any of that.
Right.
So I was an unusual audience member. I don't think that there'd be any problem attracting my generation to the show. And I think that a lot of people will go see it who lived through it. I don't think it's meant to be harrowing, but I think that he did have a little bit of a mission to remind people what went down and what it was like to live through it. And he did a really good job.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, the show is somewhat scaffolded in this framework, semi-fictional, of him being asked as a queer elder to make a statement at this event for the community. And the show kind of begins with this sort of cheeky framing of the actual director of this production, framing it as if it is a queer elder lecture series, I think was the framing that was used.
Honestly, I thought that may be what was going on.
Yeah, no, I believe that was just a device.
There is no such thing as a queer elder.
Mm-hmm.
I thought maybe he was one of many who will give reminiscences, but I understand now that was a little bit of a device.
Yeah.
And it clearly worked.
It did. Yeah, no, it was a very authentic expression of that. And then so much of the narrative, I think, spins off from this questioning of what does it mean to be a queer elder? What is the responsibility that you have to the community? And I think you raised an interesting question there about how it maybe spoke to you differently than it did to most of the audience who didn't live through this type of experience. And I wonder, do you think this show is designed to have that sort of educational bent of this is to carry the torch for those who didn't live through it? Or is it just as much, if not more so, targeted as a reminiscence to share with those of your generation who maybe did also share these experiences?
I think that's a really good question. I don't think that it needs an answer one or the other.
Right.
I think it works both ways. Definitely, he actually, I think you noticed, targeted me at
I
one.
did notice. So yeah, you locked eyes a few times.
And he beady-eyed me when he made a remark or something, and he even pointed at me at one point.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I was the only obvious gay man of a certain generation in the audience, or at least in the front. No, not at all. I don't think it's at all targeted to us. I think it is definitely targeted to a general audience, and rightfully so. I think it's a story. Well, he specifically said you should go see Philadelphia. You should go see Rent. Although Rent is a pretty aggressively straight.
Yeah. Well, I will point out this might be veering a bit into spoilers, but when he did say that it was kind of taking on the role of another character who represents the corporate sponsor of this lecture series, who maybe has a less informed view of this experience, but filters it through these media properties that they think tell the proper story.
By the way, I saw Rent on what do they call them? Sawhorses. Mm-hmm. That is no sets, just
concert experience type.
I saw it off Broadway before it was released, before it actually opened, with a good friend of mine who had a subscription to, I think it was the Manhattan New York Theatrical Society or one of those things, back when I lived there. And we saw it was almost entirely the cast that would go on to be on the off Broadway and then the Broadway show, mm-hmm. some of whom even made it to the movie.
Right.
Jonathan
Larson,
the author, died the day before mm-hmm. we saw it.
Wow.
So he never saw it. And that was a poignant thing. When I saw Rent, it was quite soon after experiencing the AIDS epidemic and all the loss and so on. Some of the songs were changed, and some of the songs that I heard were actually, in my opinion, better than what was later commercially produced. There was one song in particular that ultimately was released as, I think, one song. Character wants to be a star, and he has his guitar and he wants to sing. The original was called Through the Woods into the Sea. It talks about driving through the forest and seeing the Pacific Ocean. And a Pacific Coast Highway, I think it might have been called. And that original song just tore you apart. I think he had to tone it down a little bit for a general audience. And I think this show also, as gut-wrenching as it is, also tones it down a little bit. Mm-hmm. Not too much not to feel it, though. I sure did feel it. And is it a revelation to people who didn't live through it? I guess, sure. It's got to be, because, if you weren't there, mm-hmm. it's hard for me to remember how it felt to be in the middle of a pandemic, the first great pandemic of our times, and where people and love were dying every week. Mm-hmm. It's and to make art out of suffering, well, that's a little bit like, what was the old story of was it Rapunzel or somebody who took straw and knitted it into gold?
Rumpelstiltskin is the fable. It's the princess from Rumpelstiltskin. Yep.
Yes, that's right. Mm-hmm. And so isn't that one of the mandates of art, is to take the straw and make gold out of it? Mm-hmm. And so he made some gold tonight. And I think it's in the form of the gold that you can accept and digest it. The raw story itself is too much to bear.
I think that's very well said. And that might be a good moment to transition into spoiler zone. So before we do, this is a public display of affection. If anybody wants to see it, it is playing at the Streetcar Crow's Nest until April 20th, 2025. Okay. I am going to put a spoiler icon up on the screen for those who are watching this on YouTube. You'll see that right about now. And at this point, anything goes. There's a lot that I think we've been apprehensive to get into in terms of the details of this show. Where would you like to start?
Talk about gut-wrenching. He tells the story of being a 15-year-old boy who leaves Oshawa because his family can't accept his sexuality, and he ends up on the streets of Toronto. And I think that he sanitized it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, like, he didn't touch much upon the drugs, and I don't know if he ever hustled himself.
Sure.
But he talked about his friends hustling, and at one point he was a little bit coy about saying he got into the cars too. So, but the scene he describes, the gay scene in 1979 in Toronto, seedy, trashy, smelly, very low class, poorest church mice living, sleeping on the floor and eking out some kind of an existence. And he talks about it. He describes it as a rather horrible place, but he reminds us the best, the most wonderful time. And I had the same experience in New York. When I moved to New York was bankrupt. They were not replacing light bulbs in the street lamps. That whenever they went out, the garbage was not being collected. And talk about smelly. But we were anything goes.
Yeah.
Sex, drugs, rock and roll, and we lived to the fullest. Was it pretty? It was ugly. Was it classy? It was totally low class. Totally low class. I came from a very middle class Toronto environment, good schools and a good education and all the rest. I dropped all of that baggage. When I went to New York, I became a dog. And those were, I think, to this day, my happiest days. And Jonathan evoked that very well, talking about his friends, their tight friendship, their anything goes lifestyle, getting in and out of cars for $20 and doing what you needed to do to get the $20, and a wonderful sense of shamelessness about it. In those days, we grew up, all of us grew up as the best little boys in the world. We were expected to become doctors or lawyers or something, get married and have kids. And at some point, it became evident to us we were never going to live up to that. Freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. Once you abandon the main track, you become free to do anything. And we did everything. And I'm not ashamed of any of it, by the way.
No, nor should you be.
A lot of it is traditionally shameful behavior. It was a riot. I was the right age to do it, in the right place to do it. And evidently, Jonathan found that Toronto was the right. I left Toronto because it wasn't racy enough for me. I found I could get laid more times in a weekend in New York than in 6 months in Toronto. Evidently, he had better luck than I did. But then again, he was 15 and pretty. I guess there's a market for that. But we abandoned all the bounds of society. We lived a completely bohemian life. And in fact, Rent is a loose adaptation of La Boheme, which is a story of a bohemian lifestyle in all its sides and senses. And there was an immense joy to that. And I think Jonathan really evoked that well. And just when we were like tripping along, and of course, he did mention that the police were evil and targeted us and, would beat us and drag us, to somewhere else, strip us and so on. I never had that happen to me personally, but I do know people for whom that was a reality. He was telling the story as something that was joyous, ultimately.
Yeah. Queer joy is a term that comes up a lot in the show.
Yeah. As vile and filthy and smelly and stinky and dirty as it was wonderfully explosively living. And I think that most people never live quite that fundamentally, viscerally. And then, of course, the tone changes. Here comes the AIDS epidemic. You start to see people you know and love. And he talks about his vinyl address book where he's written his friends' names and so on. And as as the time comes for them, he has to cross them out. He crosses their names out in a ballpoint pen, but that's not enough. He has to take a big fat Sharpie, and the ink bleeds to the other side of the page. And that's evocative. And I mentioned before we started the podcast that I had an artifact from that age. We had something in the old days called a Rolodex before there were smartphones. This is a Rolodex. Everybody gets a card. They're alphabetized. These are the cards. And what I found myself doing is when one of my friends or lovers or former friends or former lovers would die, I would take their card out and write RIP on them and put them in the back.
In red marker? Yeah.
This is the section of people who were alive when I stopped keeping this up. Many of these people are now deceased too. I am 70 after all. That's to be expected. That's the circle of life. This part is unnatural. These are people in their 20s and their 30s. And they are one after another. RIP, 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 big and small. Sometimes I mentioned, and the names of the people. There are a lot of names people would know. That's why I was a little bit cagey about showing the Rolodex itself.
Yeah,
a lot of famous people in that list because, well, you know, I was pretty and smart and well spoken, so I got to know a lot of gay and even celebrities outside gay, but gay friendly. And a lot of the people in that Rolodex are people everyone would recognize out of discretion. I don't mention any of the names. And the section for the dead is bigger than the section for the living. Yeah. That's something, if you haven't lived through it, I'm reminded of my French family. Every side of my family, the boys went off to fight in the First World War in the trenches, and the mortality level was very, very high. There would be a family with 7 kids, 3 girls and 4 boys. After the war, there was 3 girls and 1 boy. Yeah. Some family names were snuffed out because all the males were machine gunned in the trenches. They lived through something that I recognize, where death was omnipresent, where survivorship carried guilt.
Yeah.
And Jonathan was quite explicit about the blithe term survivor guilt. I've got it. All the people in my generation who are still with me. And, my Facebook friends from New York, of which there are about 20 or 30, we represent 200 or 300. We all remember each other from the time, but all the people around us, many of them aren't even my close friends, but we're friends with my friends. And that's the bond today, is that we knew Tony and Jerry. And at one point he starts listing names. I don't know if they were really names of people he knew who died or whether that's part of his artistic license, but I could spend the rest of the podcast listing the names of people who meant something to me who are gone. And that's where the show takes a really dark turn. And I guess there is an educative side to it. I think that he felt the need as an elder gay. Elder queer. Is that right?
Queer elder is the term he uses, but I don't think he would flinch at being called gay.
No. In fact, he specifically he called himself gay at one point and then corrected himself queer. And, this is something we started out not even having a name for ourselves. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I went years through high school not recognizing why it was that the gymnast made my heart thump. I felt it. It was exciting and exhilarating and terrifying, but I never thought of it in sexual terms. Mm-hmm. We didn't have a name for it. We didn't have and then when I finally came out, I looked back and I realized, oh, okay, that's what I was feeling. But then it was, at that point, it was gay. That's what we called
Of course,
ourselves.
yeah.
And we didn't start to hear queer until the 90s,
Mhm.
which for you, I don't know, what year were you born?
I was born in 94.
Okay. I lost my lover of 10 years in 92. And he talks about going to the hospital, his good friend Tommy, and he didn't have the courage to go visit Tommy in the hospital. And he felt terrible guilt about that. How many of my friends I didn't visit because there were too many and I couldn't see them. I couldn't see them all through. I did, of course, my lover. He died in my arms, me telling him I loved him. And there is something ennobling about completing a life cycle with somebody. I was a complete wreck for a couple or 3 years after that. You can't be bereft that way without it completely, upturning your apple cart.
Mm-hmm.
I eventually recovered. We all do. You have to move forward.
Life goes on, yeah.
And a show like this brings me right back to somewhere I never go. I don't think about it. I think about tomorrow, which is grim enough. I think about the last few years, which were wonderful. And I very rarely cast my mind back to those years, even though once I got over my grief, I had lots of fun. The 90s were lots of fun. And 90s in New York were a great party. It was the club kids and all the rest. So in a way, this show brought me back to a forbidden territory, a forbidden country.
Yeah.
But I don't regret revisiting it. And I know that tomorrow, or maybe right after this podcast, I will slide back out of it again. It's not a place I like to stay, but it was a place I lived through. And I think that's one of the functions of art, is to take something very painful and make something beautiful out of it.
Yeah. Wow. Very well said. And thank you just so much for sharing what the show meant to you, the way that it's touched on old wounds, perhaps, but in a cathartic, cleansing is a word that you used prior to us beginning recording this. And I'm just so grateful that I was able to share this experience with you, to bring you to the show that you may not have otherwise known about or thought to see. And now hearing you talk about it, like if I were reviewing this with someone from my own generation, even somebody gay from my generation, who would understand the history of what this means and think of it in historical terms, is not the same as hearing what it means to you as not history, but past of your own life experience, lived experience. And thank you so much for sharing your Rolodex. And I think that is such it is a truly moving artifact of this time, that
here's to all of those who didn't make it through.
Yeah.
And the best of them.
To them. Hopefully there is a very good gay bar in heaven.
The best.
Yeah.
It's called heaven, by the way.
Mm-hmm. One thing I want to touch on that you sort of alluded to and this is something that Jonathan talks about in the show too, and it's almost the evolution of language, that you said that when you first realized this about yourself, there wasn't a word for it. You had this, there is a scholarly term for this kind of thing, hermeneutical injustice, which I also learned recently from another show that touched on similar themes, that not having the language to articulate who you are or your lived experience, that without that language, you can't even begin to conceptualize it. You might feel things, think you're starting to understand the edges of things, but not quite have it. And until you have the language for it, you'll always exist in that kind of limbo. And then when you got the language, even if it's not the same language that we use today, there's something liberating about that. And even if that language is often used against you by those who don't see it as so liberating. And now the fact that there is a plethora of language, that it's almost a concern about, am I using the right terms? Is there a better way of putting this? Am I being inclusive enough with the language I use? I think there's something interesting that the show is touching on about the arc of progress and social progress. And hopefully it continues in the direction it is. I know earlier today, you and I were talking about history being a pendulum that swings back and forth. It's a very Hegelian idea about thesis, antithesis, hopefully stabilizing somewhere in the middle as a synthesis, but hard to say exactly the direction.
I'm not so sure. I think that it's an ideal goal that it stops in the middle somewhere. Mm-hmm. But my experience has been that it just keeps ricocheting from one extreme to another. And I experienced gay pride in New York City in 1979, actually, the year that this play takes place. And we were marching down Fifth Avenue, and, we had Stonewall had happened in 1968. So this was about a decade later. We had consolidated our sense of self, our sense of self-worth, our feeling that we had a right to exist and a right to be who we were. And no one could take that away from us. And Anita Bryant was protesting with her orange juice and getting pies in the face. And we were laughing at her expense. And we were marching down Fifth Avenue. And as we went by St. Patrick's Cathedral, the Catholics had banded there with their big posters, "You're going to hell," and "Burn, faggot burn," and so on. And we were right in their face. We had a sense of self-pride and justification. We were fingering and saying, "F you," and, out of my face. And so on. We were like, and we got more and more wound up. And at one point, I had to pull myself out of the parade because I was shaking with emotion and fury. And I felt like a Nazi in Nuremberg, whipped up by Hitler to do anything. I felt I could have punched one of those sanctimonious assholes right in the face. And I'm a completely unviolent person. I've never been in a fight in my life. 70.
Yeah.
No fights. That's 0 for 70. Mm-hmm. And I realized what it was to feel a mob mentality. I had to pull myself out and calm down and so on. And after that, I walked a little away from the wildest, noisiest members. And I really had to take stock of myself. I saw a side of myself that I didn't even know existed. And the other thing I noticed at that time was we were so sure of ourselves that we had achieved our liberation. But historian that I was, pendulum that I saw throughout history, I couldn't help but reflect that even if we were getting more and more liberated, all it would take was a political current and this pendulum would start swinging the other way. I used to worry about being on record in some sense or another, and they could come for me one day. And, 79 turned to 89, and we went through the worst of AIDS. And far from, some blamed us, but most had a kind heart and saw us as victims and saw us as unfair victims because so much more could have been done to help us. And Reagan and company just refused to act. And there was so much unnecessary suffering. I think that came into the benefit on the ledger, that we were seen as unfair victims of a disease that we didn't deserve, and suffering that was unconscionable for anybody to go through. And, horrible things like he touched upon where they visit their friend Tommy, who's dying in the hospital, and the nurse comes and chases them out and says, "Family only." Mm-hmm. I lived that. Yeah. I remember when at St. Vincent's, at first, you had to be able to show your credentials as bloodline family members. Most of these guys dying had left Iowa or some other place years before, and their family was their gay friends. They're the people who meant something to them and who loved them and who cared for them and couldn't see them, couldn't go into the room. That changed, by the way. By the time my boyfriend was in St. Vincent's, he had a few visits, but it was completely accepting. And I'm the one who signed the do not resuscitate order, even though legally I wasn't in any way legally entitled to do so. They took it and operated on that basis. Then the 90s came and sort of AIDS was kind of behind us. It was controllable. It was manageable. Gay people once again were celebrating their lives and so on. And still no backlash. The pendulum was still out there. 79, 89, 99, 09, 19. I long ago decided that the gains were durable, that we had established our place in society. We were accepted by any right-thinking person. If you had a stick up your ass about gay people, you were the bigot. You were the problem. Gay people had a right to exist. I felt that we had won that war. I am not at all so sure now. I'm seeing the world change right now, politics in the States, but elsewhere too, in Russia, in Hungary, in Turkey, in, God forbid, the Islamic countries, kids getting caught doing something and then getting blindfolded and tossed off the roof of a building to die. I see it. I don't know if they're going to be coming for me one day, Ryan. It still feels remote, but it's no longer a value of zero. It's definitely a possibility. Did it take 50 years, 60 years really, for the pendulum to swing? But is it swinging? Are we living the last days of a liberal, inclusive society? And again, Jonathan brings this point up. He talks about, did we add too many letters to our name? Did we turn people off by including this, this, and this, and this? Should we have just stuck to 4? Is it the acceptance of trans that was one step too far and that couldn't be accepted? And now it's going to bring the whole house of cards down. It might yet. I think Bill Maher talks about it in his show, where he feels that and he's left of center, but he talks about how left, all this language police and thought police and so on the left really alienated a lot of people in the middle and sent some of them to the right. And I don't know. I'm not one to judge really, but I have heard radio shows and so on, which were a little preachy, went a little bit far. And I don't watch a lot of TV, but I do listen to the CBC. And there have been times when I thought, oh God, this again. Where's the gardening show when I want it? So I do understand people who aren't directly involved, not feeling like they have a stake in the matter and being just a little bit, not just bored, but okay, we heard your story, that's enough. And he was talking about coming out and now going in. And I'm not the guy that's going to go in. I'll go down in flames, but I can understand if there are people who are starting to think maybe it's time to start being discreet. And I know among my Facebook friends, there are the ones who don't want to see the political diatribes or even the humor because they're worried that down the road, someone's going to be looking at their computer history and picking them out. And we've seen it happen. We know, Hitler, if you had a past history in something that was politically not aligned with the power, that could very well be death. And, the Jews, we remember the Jews very much about Auschwitz and Birkenau and all the rest. Gays, intellectuals, deeply religious people who felt that fascism was in a very fundamental moral sense wrong. They all were killed too. Mm-hmm. And, they come after the intellectuals, they come after the deviants and so on. Is that where we're going, it looks like it might be. And it is chilling. So, seeing a play like this, it's not just a reminiscence and an evocation of a horrible tribulations that a community endured. It's also a warning.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And this is making me think a lot of the things you're bringing up about the title of the show itself, A Public Display of Affection. And this is a motif that recurs throughout the piece.
Yeah.
I believe it was first invoked in him referring to a young couple that he saw in, I think it was a Starbucks or possibly just a coffee shop, and he said young and then corrected, well, under 40, but they were just kids.
That's
but
my young too.
Yeah, there was something fascinatingly unfascinating about how they were able to just hold hands across a table and nobody batted an eye, and that was simultaneously a political act that is political by virtue of how unradical it seems. And I
spent the week in Mexico City last week. I can't tell you how many times we saw two guys walking down the street holding hands. Now, I've been in Rome, and when you see two guys holding hands in Rome, that doesn't mean they're gay necessarily. They have a very easygoing physicality between straight friends. But these guys were gay, and they were in Mexico, and they were holding hands. And my boyfriend, now 25 years, Jonathan was talking how he's been with his boyfriend for 23 years, how they fought for the right to get married, but then when they got the right to get married, they didn't bother to do it. That's the same with Greg and myself. We were, definitely pro gay marriage as a right, but we never did. We didn't really feel the need to pursue this bourgeois affirmation. We do sometimes fantasize about wedding gifts. Mm-hmm. It's nice. It's nice when everybody gives you something nice, but I don't know that we'll ever get married. And we've been 25 years together, and we're not that PDA.
That's the type.
We don't hold hands in public. Greg is a little more circumspect than I am. I probably would if he wanted to. I wouldn't have a problem with it, but I like it when I see it. I like it. I'm with Jonathan on this. Seeing young under 40 gay men holding hands in public and nobody bats an eye, that feels like an accomplishment. Because boy, when I was young, two guys holding hands in public, they'd get beaten up. And the guys beating them up would feel, they deserved it. That was transgressive. And so we have come a long way, baby. I just wonder how long we're going to stay there.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think this idea of the marriage and marriage rights in particular, that Jonathan and his now husband did in fact have
I think they're
common law is the term, but they did have a small little legal ceremony at the courthouse that was
declaring their common law status.
Yes, exactly. It wasn't like a proper, wedding with flowers and everything, but it does certify them as an actual legally conjoined unit. And then I think the language of the public display of affection comes back when they're taking the bus or the streetcar home from their little official ceremony.
Is out and they hold hands on the bus.
And I think that's
sweet.
Yeah, it's sweet. It's beautiful. Like there's something about it almost, there's like a twinge of ironic, I don't want to say derision, in that introductory invocation of the theme at the Starbucks, where it's just like how far we've come, but haven't we lost something? Like, are we even transgressive anymore? At what point does the margin become the center? And if now it's able to be co-opted by these corporate sponsors who are trying to rainbow wash their...
That's a really good point you bring up. We aren't the edge anymore. Mm-hmm. And long ago, gay males became mainstream. We stopped feeling like we were transgressive. In fact, we began to expect people to accept us. Anybody who, dared to express a homophobic point of view, that was on them.
Mhm.
They were the problem. They were Neanderthals, and because so many more extreme versions of sexuality and or non-sexuality, even asexuality and transsexuality, and all of those extra letters, the rest of the alphabet, were far, far, far off center from where we were. And I have some gay friends who aren't even especially interested in or supportive of those farther ones. For them, the war has been won. We gay men have gotten our established cred and acceptance, and that's when they stopped being interested. They got what they needed and so forth. And to them, trans people they're not sisters in the fight. They're something else, outside of their ken. And I understand that. It's very seductive to feel like you're part of the mainstream. We're geared to want to be the right ones, the ones that are doing it, the normal ones. Being a gay male now is kind of normal. I used to switch pronouns talking to the plumber or something, and talk about, my spouse in a she and so on. I didn't feel like it was necessary or appropriate to share that side of myself. Now I don't at all. I'll say, well, my boyfriend tried to unplug the toilet and it didn't work. Mm-hmm. And I don't expect a reaction from the plumber. Mm-hmm. That is quite a step.
It's progress. Yeah.
Well, yeah, hopefully it stays. It's always tinged now. And this is new. I just felt, wow, that's progress made. That's a step taken as society has moved forward, and it's never going back. But of course, that's just my little corner of horror at what the socio-political scene is turning into now. And so fast, the speed at which the situation is evolving or devolving, that's what's most disquieting, because it's becoming increasingly clear that there isn't a proper response. And it's when first they came for you, everyone's heard. First they came to us and we said nothing. Then they came and, well, eventually they come for you. I don't know about you, because you're, a cis, male, white, etc.
Jewish.
Well, yeah. Will they come for you? Maybe.
That's the first line of the poem.
And then they're going to come for my cat.
Everybody.
Stop. And who's safe? I guess there is a tiny little kernel that are safe and with their obedient wives or whatever. But I mean,
the point of the poem is that nobody's safe. Eventually they come for everybody. They come for each other after there's nobody else to come for.
Right. And reacting against that trend is there's a sand clock, whatever that's called.
Yeah, hourglass. Yeah.
An hourglass, and the sand runs out. At some point, you can't turn the tide back. I'm not sure that point hasn't already been crossed. I hope not. But the future is by no means guaranteed to us anymore. And we used to feel that way. Again, in this play, I think he didn't really belabor it, but he did touch upon the sense of the fragility of the progress.
Yeah. Fragile progress is an interesting opposition to a term you used earlier, which was durable gains, to refer to how you felt about the progress that was made and how mainstream it had all become. And I think perhaps if there's a glimmer of hope that we can try to take from this, and perhaps it's naivete, and I hope it's not, but that by having become part of the mainstream, perhaps it neuters the radicalism, takes away some of the edge, no longer feels like you're fighting the fight, and that can make it difficult to re-enter the fight when that's required. But it also makes the fight that is being had against the community the antagonistic force. And enough people who have, much like your plumber, accepted the normalcy of queer coupling without batting an eye at it, they can't have such short memories that they won't recall that that is a new state of normalcy, or perhaps not even that new, but an element of just regular social behavior that is being attacked unfairly by those who are taking issue with it. And as you said, we recognize them as the bigots. And it is obviously concerning how rapidly things are changing and deteriorating, but there is, I think, good reason to hope that there is enough of a care for what has been accepted as normal to be a bulwark against that. Perhaps that's being naive. You tell me if you think so.
I tell you, I hope you're right. I think you're right. I think that the vast majority of people, and now let's get off the gay particularity of this, because it's much bigger than that.
Yeah.
I think that the vast majority of people don't accept this kind of radical fascistic thinking and acting. I think that, farmers losing fifth generation farms because of economic policies that are clearly all about just putting more money in the ultra rich pockets, that this is just the concentration of wealth at the top, and that they have been sold a bill of goods, and the scales fall away from their eyes. As that progresses, as an overwhelming majority of the population realizes that this is not good for them and it's not good for anyone, the question is, how will the juggernaut be halted in its tracks? And it is gaining speed, and it has a momentum, and it's going to be very hard to stop. And I'm worried that it can't be stopped without violence. And I told you at the beginning that I am the most unviolent person in the world. I'm 70 years old. Will I be called upon to pick up a machine gun and go and fight in a war? I'm still fit. I could still do it. Would I do it? I think I would have to. Mm-hmm. And, look at the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
They are on the front line, all kinds of ages and conditions, fighting for their country, fighting for their freedom. We in Canada have lived in I don't even think it was a fool's paradise. It was the real deal. We were just happy neighbors and so on. So I would love to believe that this nightmare will end, and soon, and it will be a kind of an inoculation, a vaccination, that sort of thing won't happen again for a long time. Look at the Germans after Nazism. They became the most wonderful, accepting, loving, kind, moral people you could imagine. And by the way, the Germans before the Nazis were a highly moral, artistic, and so this is a sickness that comes, and it's a cynical sickness. It's engendered by people with a special interest who somehow convince people long enough that this is in their best interest, and then they have to wake up. Well, in the case of the Germans, they were awakened violently from without. Mm-hmm. They had to be conquered. I don't know who's going to be conquering the USA. So the only way I can see this coming out well is if there's a groundswell of opposition within the United States. And I can see that happening, but it's going to take some time because you have to build up the steam. And the American left is all talk, no action. There's no concerted, we're going to have to see some blood, I'm afraid. And I hate that idea. But if that's what it takes, the alternative is unthinkable. And the gays' suffering is a minuscule detail, side issue of everybody else's suffering, because it's going to be general. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry to get so far.
No, it's okay. And what I would perhaps say, gently nudging against that, is I don't think it is a small detail. I think it's very much part of the generality of what you're describing here. And I think the fact that the trans community in particular has been so scapegoated and being used as this target to drum up the hate, the first they came for them will be them. And it is germane that we do what we can to defend that community, not just out of self-interest because they'll come for us next, but because this is the fight that's happening.
And the right thing to do.
Of course.
I mean, I think that the vast majority, I would say easily, Trump was elected with 30% of the vote, or 30 something percent of the vote. And a lot of those are disaffected now.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if push came to shove, it would be an overwhelming majority that resisted and wanted to switch gears. But it's going to take a spark to set them on fire. And right now, we're not seeing that. I have seen some little niggling hits of a groundswell. And I would like to think that that's going to build up steam and it's going to be unstoppable. I think that in our modern age, with the kind of communications we have, it will be possible to resist. And I hope that at some point, the unpopularity of that hideous, vile, criminal regime will be toppled. And we saw it in Brazil. They toppled Bolsonaro, and he's going to jail now. And will Teflon Don ever find an orange suit to match his makeup? We can dream, and maybe we will be gratified.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I appreciate. I think, yes, this is not far afield from what the show is sparking from us. This is very much it's part and parcel with the conversations that this show is engaging. Is there any last thing you'd like to say about the show itself before we wrap up?
See the show.
Yes,
it's very it's thought provoking. It's for some it will be nostalgia evoking, but for others it'll be a window into a world that is completely foreign to them. And isn't that one of the great jobs of literature, is to put you in the skin of somebody experiencing something that not only have you never experienced, but you never will. And you grow as a person when you see the world another way. So well worth the 80 minutes.
No, that's great. Before we do wrap up, there's one thing that I would maybe like to have you share. There was a show that was in the same venue, that studio space at Crow's, just a few months ago. It was called Big Stuff. And in fact, it was by a married comedy duo named Matt Barham and Naomi Sneakus. And in fact, they were in the audience on opening night when we saw this. I saw them from across the hall. Okay. And they had an interesting thing in that show. And perhaps I'm just thinking of this now because I saw their faces in the same room where I saw their show. But it was something about how when you say the name of someone you've lost, it brings them with you. And it, in a way, it acknowledges the loss, but also shows that they're never really gone. And a little while ago, especially while you were talking about your Rolodex, you mentioned how you could spend the rest of this podcast just naming names of the people that you've lost. I would say maybe perhaps not first and last names, because there is an element of discretion around the identities of certain people, but perhaps in the spirit of that show and this show, if you would like to say the first names of a few people who meant a lot to you and let them continue to live in the atmosphere, I think that would be a very touching way of resolving this.
Kent, first and foremost, the first great love of my life. Kenny, Stephen, oh boy, Drew, Shay, Alan, Dennis, Peter. Oh, the list goes on. Oh my God! But I think that's a good start, yes. And probably just as well I stop.
Yeah, and Jonathan shared his own list of names at one key point in the show, which is probably also what
choked me up.
It did, yeah.
And choked the names, choked me right up.
It choked me up too, and I fortunately don't have my own list like that. But I just hear
you that you don't. Mm-hmm. I would wish this. This is not a badge of honor. This is a terrible thing to have gone through. I will say this, though. Suffering is ennobling.
Mm-hmm.
I came out of that a much better person than I went in. All young people are selfish. Oh, I guess that's too much of a blanket, but most people are selfish. Most young people just think about themselves. When you go through the ringer, when fate, circumstance calls upon you to make sacrifices, to do something that you would never have thought of doing, to suffer, you do it burns away the chaff and leaves a gleaming, I'm not a gleaming, I'm no angel. He joked about how even the angels weren't angels, and I was surely no angel, and I'm no angel today. I probably still would count myself as mainly selfish, self-centered, self-absorbed. But boy, I've come a long way, baby. And I think going through the crucible of an epidemic like that, and seeing so much suffering and death and loss and pain, you do come out of it a better person. So nothing is for nothing.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to end. So thank you, Robert. This has been a wonderful experience seeing this show with you and getting to unpack it in such depth and historical and personal rigor that you have brought to this conversation. I cannot thank you enough for this.
Oh, thank you, Ryan, for inviting me. It was a real experience.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So that's it for our episode here. Robert, do you want to plug, I don't know if you're on social media or if you want to plug your Etsy store at the end of this episode? Does that feel in bad taste after what we've spoken about?
Not at all.
Okay. At all. That's very good. Well, we can find Cup of Hemlock Theatre at COH Theatre on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, or Cup of Hemlock Theatre on YouTube, where you might be watching this, Cup of Hemlock Theatre podcast, and all the podcast places where you might be listening to this. Like, share, subscribe, calls to action, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, once again, Robert, thank you so much for joining me. And I raise my cup to you, to all of the names that you and Jonathan have shared. And we will, God willing, see you all in the next episode. Cheers.
Have a lovely night.